Is it a sign that you are on the road to transcendence as a human? If you see something like a flag burning and are able to have like a non-emotional response?
Well, just because people are going to church doesn't mean those motivations go away.
Ray Dalio mentions that we've kind of abandoned our ability or our desire to compromise, and it's kind of
Mm.
this win at all cost mindset has taken over.
Man, I feel like we're being assimilated into something I don't like. It's not leading to life. What can I do? Build gardens right where you're at, metaphorically, and literally.
So yes, Paul, you were saying.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I've for years have kind of been in this interesting um integration of different disciplines has been my focus. So I have a background in theology, and actually it's a very specific niche discipline of theology that people call cultural theology, which is essentially to say there's stuff happening in culture that has a lot more of what we might consider, or at least people long ago would consider to be of like religious value. Even though we're a more secular leaning society, that those sorts of things, the values, the way people tell stories, the way they pursue meaning in life, hasn't changed that much. Like humans, our human nature hasn't changed that much. So, what are some of the sort of the ways that we can see, for example, Clay knows this from our conversations and the work we've done together over the years. I have a lot of interest in the ways in which like film and television end up being like you could consider for many people like a substitute church sermon. So you're going and you're taking in these stories. So instead of people going to Sunday school or going to church to hear a sermon, there's still plenty of people that do that. A lot of people get a sense of like, hey, what's the good life look like from going to a movie theater or going and, binge watching something on Netflix. So that's kind of been some of my areas of particular focus is seeing and then tracking like cultural trends, seeing the ways in which culture changes over time. And we could call it like spiritual changes. I know that might be a word that feels a little wooey to some, but maybe the simplest way of thinking of that is you probably remember back to high school when you'd have like a school pep fest before the homecoming game, and what was one of the cheers? Like, we got spirit. Yes, we do. We got spirit. How about you? And you felt like, oh man, school spirit was super strong heading into that homecoming football game. And then imagine what it was like if your team lost to the crosstown rival. That next day at school, when you were walking through the building, you would say, well, the school spirit isn't quite as high. You could say that was a spiritual change. So I'm really interested in the ways in which we could call like spiritual changes happen in culture.
It's funny you say that because we both went to the University of Tennessee. And
Oh
because we grew
yeah.
up kind of like all over the place, I can't say that I mean, I'm an outlier in our family, but I can't say that I was like a huge football enthusiast at the time. And at Tennessee, I would literally be like, oh, great. If we lose, like people are going to not be having as much fun later, which is the only thing I really care about doing, but that was
Right.
definitely like a palpable, energetic, collective experience.
Oh yeah, no, the
Yeah, you
night
could
wasn't
feel it
going
in
to
the
be the
air,
same.
right?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I mean, from our perspective, it was like, come on, guys, like, who cares? We didn't play in it, like, let's move on. There's
supposed
nothing
to
we
be
can do
fun.
now.
Supposed to be fun.
Supposed to
Come
be
on.
fun. Right. But it's like, obviously, those things, those energies are real. Okay. So I
For
guess before
sure.
we dive too far into anything else, Clay, would you like to kind of give a similar uh, overview of your background?
Yeah, so I'm a psychologist, and I think of myself as what's called an existential psychologist, which is a subfield of not really even a field, it's, like a sub area of interest within psychology, focused on how people approach and grapple with the big questions that are inherent to being a cognitively advanced organism like humans. So we have the capacity to ask deep questions, to turn inward, to reflect on the self, to look up at the stars and wonder our place in the cosmos, to ponder whether or not we have any value that's going to trans or meaning that's going to transcend our mortal existence. As far as we know, these are specific to these questions, concerns, anxieties, aspirations are specific to humans. I think my dog has some concerns, but I don't think they're existential. I think they're more moment to moment and maybe some basic social concerns. Maybe other primates deal with some elementary like version of this, but humans are the only ones, to connect to Paul's cultural point, the only ones engaged in this enterprise of constructing and maintaining and defending cultural structures and institutions that help guide us through these types of questions and concerns. And so you can take a person and take a flag or something like a national flag that has a lot of symbolic power to them, and you can light it on fire, and it's just a cloth. It shouldn't be that bothersome, but it's deeply offensive to many, many people,
Mhm.
right? And these kind of cultural symbols represent, deeply held beliefs and worldviews. As far as we know, we're the only organism really deeply in that game of culture of cultural life. And so I was a professor a long time, and then now I work at a think tank. And I was trying to actually remember when Paul was talking when we first connected, what year that was. But many years ago, I was working on a project on the decline of religion, and what the project was about was how humans, like Paul said, have these spiritual concerns, questions. I was very interested in the existential questions, and I thought to myself, well, just because people are going to church doesn't mean those motivations go away. It'd be like saying, to me, I thought of it like this. It'd be like saying, well, people decided to quit eating potatoes. I guess people don't need calories anymore. You'd say, no, they're eating something else because they still have caloric needs. Maybe they've switched to, rice or something. And so I was curious about, well, what are people doing instead? If we're seeing this decline in religious participation. And I had a grant at the time and to look into this. And one of the things that we discovered is people were becoming more invested in other types of like paranormal beliefs, like UFOs, ghosts, astrology. Astrology is bigger than ever. I think the New York Times has like relaunched their astrology section.
Yeah, we
And
don't know anything about that, Clay.
right, I'm sure. So there's all these other supernatural, paranormal, magical types of curiosities that people appear to have that aren't the same by any means as religion, and I'd argue are not very good substitutes in a lot of ways. I think that can be empirically demonstrated, but it shows that they're trying to do something, that they still have these needs and they still want the world to be enchanted in some way, to feel mysterious in some way, to not just be rational or empirical, but to have some kind of essence that's magical. And so I became interested in that many years ago. And I think that's how Paul and I connected because I went on his podcast and he
Yeah.
was obviously he knows a lot more about theology than I do, of course. And so I think that's where we ended up connected. And we've been kind of in contact and friends ever since. And now, yeah, Paul's working with us at the Human Flourishing Lab because that's been an area that we've been really missing. I mean, at the lab, one of our goals is to have a holistic approach to the human well-being. And so we think about psychology, we think about social life, we think about economics, we think about those other things. But obviously, we're missing a big chunk of the human experience because people have a lot of, whether they explicitly acknowledge it or not, or however they might think about it in different ways, clearly have spiritual interests and motivations. And so we're really excited to be working with Paul because he's going to bring a lot of unique expertise and insight into those questions, I think.
Okay, well, we think that what y'all are doing is incredibly interesting and are really excited to be having this chat. And before we get into what I think we might really want to focus on in our conversation, I have a question about something that you said, Clay.
Hmm.
You used the example of flag burning
Hmm.
and the fact that, that's really just a piece of cloth. If someone sets it on fire, what does that even mean? And we've thought about that kind of thing many, many times. Like, even in the context of like our children occasionally use colorful language. And it's like, well, technically, it's just a few letters
Just like some
in a
sounds.
combination,
Right.
And so my question is, if is it a sign that you are on the road to transcendence as a human? If you see something like a flag burning and are able to have like a non-emotional response, or is there something wrong with us if, we see something like that and view it as like, hey, it's just a piece of cloth, guys.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's a good question. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say there's something wrong. I think most people can't do if they don't do that, it's because it's the piece of cloth that doesn't mean something to them,
Hmm.
maybe. But I think we all have sacred symbols and important symbols that we attach ourselves to in some ways. And again, that's part of what makes humans unique is our imaginative capacities. We can say, in my work in nostalgia, for example, like you can see the arcade machine behind me. You could say, well, we have all these objects that we would, sometimes think of. It's an enlightened state to say, like, I don't care about physical possessions. And some level, I agree with that. It's good not to be too attached to material things. But a lot of the reason we're attached to them isn't just like greed or conspicuous consumption or something like that. It's because they are reminders, they are symbols, they are markers of something important in our life. Oftentimes memories. We like to have things that remind us of cherished memories. But there are also things that are signals of beliefs, and that's how we communicate. The written language is just a bunch of symbols. But
Hmm.
in our head, the symbols turn into stories, meaningful stories,
Mhm.
right? And so you can read a text and imagine. You can read a book, a fiction book. You don't have to watch a movie, right? You can read a fiction book and imagine those characters in your head. So it's just human nature to attach value to those things. And in fact, we have to go to great lengths to do what you said to kind of, to take a step back and say, like that is just a piece of cloth. But the reason we find it offensive isn't because the cloth's burning. The reason we find it offensive is because somebody's, making their own cultural message, which is to stay what that cloth represents, they're against.
Right.
And so
Mhm.
that's where, these kind of, battles take place, I suppose, over cultural icons.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think it's just, that's probably not a great answer to your question, but I think at some level it's human nature, and it is good, obviously, for the purposes of peace and well-being, to, not overreact um, violations of cultural icons. But there's a reason they're so powerful in our lives, and that's a deeply human reason.
Well, actually, I think it's a
Yeah.
good
If I
answer.
can add to that, Clay.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think the thing, Clay mentioned this already, there's a difference between the sort of existential satisfaction a dog has and what a human experiences, right? You take your dog, I don't have a dog, but I hear you take a dog for a walk, you feed it, they're relatively happy. There's something unique about us in that we are storied creatures and we are always trying to figure out our place inside the story.
Mhm.
And so if you think about like, people can think of religion as like, well, religion is about, invisible deities and supernatural. But I think, the theologian Paul Tillich in the 20th century, I think he framed religion in a more helpful way when he said religion is about figuring out what should be of ultimate concern. And so, in that sense, everybody has something, a story they're living in, which is like, this story points me in the direction of what should be of ultimate concern in my life. So you think back to your parents or whoever your caretakers were that tried to tell you, because you don't get born into the world with a map. So your parents, your caretakers, the school you went to, your surrounding culture gives you a story. And then sometimes they have a really big story that they break down into smaller stories. Like my dad, I always loved the story of the three little pigs he would tell me at bedtime. And you think about that story and it's so strange. It's like talking pigs, a wolf that can blow down a house. But that story's been with us for at least in Western civilization for at least several hundred years. We don't even know where it began. And why was my dad telling me that story? Well, he was actually trying to transmit values to me. And so when we tell stories, stories give us, we do this weird thing in our brain with narratives where it wasn't like he was giving me a PowerPoint presentation and a lecture about, well, hard work, thinking ahead. But he gave me a story that even at 3 or 4 years old, I was able to extract values from that story. And what was one of the values that story is communicating? Well, you should plan ahead, work hard, build on a solid foundation, and you'll be able to withstand when the uncertain chaos comes barking at your door. That's a
Mhm.
crazy story to learn at like
Mhm.
lying in bed at 3 years old. So
Right.
sometimes a big part of that is you also get with the stories, you get symbols. So if you grew up in America and you grew up, let's say, in my school every day, it's probably not the case in many places, but in my school every day, we said the Pledge of Allegiance towards the flag. You put your hand over your heart. And then when we went to the football games, the high school and college football games, people sang the Star Spangled Banner. And that was a telling of the story of how we won our independence. And you do that with big flags in the stadium. It's not the cloth, right? It's like the cloth represents values. And so when people feel like the thing they deeply value is being attacked, that is, there's no shutting off feelings around, oh man, that's an attack on my values. That's an attack on my story that I believe is true about the world and my place in it. So it's more than just fabric, right? It's
Mhm.
something that's connected to the story we believe, the values we hold dear to ourselves.
I think that's a terrific segue to the conversation about civility and then also like storytelling. And so I want to go back for a minute after I sent y'all that email with some topics, to cover. I went back and looked at a blog post. And, I'm sure this happens to y'all because you are much more prolific, but I'm like, oh, what did I say here? Okay, interesting. But this post was written after the first All In Summit we attended 2 years ago. And Ray Dalio was a speaker. And he's a founder of Bridgewater, but he was there really talking about the rise and fall of empires. And so, connected to his book about that. So, Principles for a Changing World Order. So, without getting into a bunch of geopolitics, like how this relates to this civility topic is, he goes through all of the technical reasons why, here are the cycles for previous empires, and here's where the United States is. And it's not really great news if you're being objective. And so obviously the question at the conference was like, well, what do we do? Do we have a way of getting out of this, or is this just physics and it's happening? And so, he had some answers for that, but ultimately, in addition to having like a strong middle and different types of reform, handling the debt, the thing I really want to focus on is unity. And so bringing it back to the post that I sent y'all that he put out this week about curiosity, or excuse me, civility, I think civility is really what y'all are talking about when we talk about like attacking other people's values and like why that doesn't feel good. Well, that's not a very civil thing to do. And so, one thing that I want to avoid doing is saying, okay, we used to be really civil to one another because whatever we were doing before is not where we need to go again. And so, what are y'all's thoughts on civility and its sort of absolute, necessity in terms of just survival?
Yeah,
Mm.
that that's a great question. So another word that we often use in the work that we do, which is very related, civility is an important component of, is pluralism, which is we live in a society in which most of us, at some level, value the idea of freedom, right? That people should be able to live as they want, as long as it doesn't, harm others. But in order to do that in a diverse and dynamic society, there's a certain recognition that, well, that's going to involve living near, around people, or sharing a society with people who have different beliefs and priorities and interests. And that requires, pluralism, right? Like, we all are going to play by the same ground rules, but as long as you're not harming me, I'm not harming you. And in order to make that kind of pluralism work, requires a certain level of civility. I mean, I think it would be naive to assume that we can, avoid any antagonism because obviously the lines are always being fought over of like what counts as you interfering with me. We see this in like battles over in like school districts, right? With parents saying, well, I think my schools are teaching stuff to my children that's actually not my values. And so we have to negotiate that because other parents might think it's fine, right? So we live in communities, we live in society in which we're constantly negotiating that, which is going to mean disagreement, it's going to mean conflict, but disagreement can be healthy. It can be informative. Competition is good. Um, but you need some baseline civility for it not to just turn into like what some political scientists and social psychologists refer to as like affective polarization, where we're not even polarized necessarily over specific policies as much as we just don't like each other.
Are we
And
there? Are we there, do you think?
I mean, you do see high levels of that. And if you look at public polling, you'll see like, I can't remember the percentages off the top of my head of where you'll see percentage of people thinking that the people on the other who have the other political beliefs are bad people or evil. So I think there are some concerning numbers around that. But I'm also seeing, and I think Paul can speak to this, I'm also seeing like signs that people are kind of tired of that.
Mhm.
They're exhausted. They have concerns that, maybe will unite us because they, um, because they're frustrated about like the practical things, like the cost of housing.
Mhm.
There are like maybe some issues that are getting big enough, like you mentioned the national debt, that maybe are getting big enough to where people are saying, yeah, we might disagree politically and how to handle these things, but we're fighting over things that aren't helpful.
Mhm.
And I also think psychologically people are just getting tired. It takes a lot of work to hate people and to
Mhm.
be mad all the time. It's not healthy. We're in a society that is increasingly obsessed with well-being, and I think people are realizing, wow, it's actually not very psychologically healthy to be mad all the time. People are starting to wise up, I think, to the fact that there's a lot of media that thrives on clickbait and outrage, and they're getting tired of that. So I think you can, if you want to find places of hope and optimism, you certainly can. I think there are a number of polls and surveys that indicate that, and we've done some of this work ourselves, showing that Americans are actually united on a lot of things that they don't realize they are, and that they're equally kind of fed up with being mad at each other.
Mhm.
Um, so I do think there's some signs of, some of hope, but that needs to be leveraged, I think. And yeah, maybe Paul has more thoughts on that kind of the vibe that maybe he's seeing.
And maybe like, what do you think,
Yeah.
Paul, about if we're going to, again, like not return to civility, but if we're going to strive towards unity, what is required? What
Mm.
about curiosity? How do we get there? How do I become a more civil person if I decide I want to
Mm.
be more unified,
Yeah.
with my
Yeah.
neighbors, so to speak?
Hmm. One dimension that I think Clay is talking about is even when you ask the question, I found it really interesting that you asked the question in such a way where it's like you perceive that there's a lack of civility going on, but you're kind of curious if that's even true.
Mhm.
That gets to an interesting cognitive bias that we've known about for decades, going back to the work of George Gerbner in the 1970s called mean world syndrome. Mean world syndrome is this interesting cognitive bias where they found that the more people consumed dark, violent media, the more they tended to overestimate how dark and violent the world actually was. So the gap between, for example, like what people estimated the crime statistics were, number of homicides were, was a significant gap depending on how much dark and violent stories they consumed. So it became a lens by which they were interpreting the world. And none of us have a completely clear lens. The way we interpret the world is shaped by the story we believe is true. So it's really interesting, like nationally, homicides in the US, you'd think, well, if I were to ask somebody, is it worse today than it was in the 1950s? I imagine most people would say, yeah, it's far more violent. But when it comes to homicide levels nationally, the numbers are actually about the same as it was in the mid 1950s, which would be a surprise to a lot of people.
Mhm.
Now, what is giving us the sense that like there's a decrease in civility? I think there are reasons to believe that there is some merit to that, but
Mhm.
there's also some ways in which we've also found that there's been interesting studies as to people's perception. So if let's say you're a person that's really strong politically on the left, or you're really strong politically on the right, the more time people spend online, they have found that if you're really strong on the right and you spend a lot of time online, I think given the way the algorithms work now, people will have a stronger misperception of the actual beliefs that
Mhm.
people hold on the left. And it's both, it's vice versa for both sides. So this isn't a good team, bad team thing. This is a way in which the algorithms and the things that we're consuming are shaping our souls in a particular way that kind of becomes almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more outrage you consume, the more likely you are to be outraged
Mhm.
during your day. So when you get to like, your question of, well, we can't go back. One of my favorite movies is The Sandlot. And there's something like idyllic about The Sandlot, right? There's something like it's a slice of what you might say was like the golden age of America.
Mhm.
And whether that was an accurate picture of what life was really like, my dad, who lived in that age, was like, yeah, that's
Mhm.
kind of what it was like. And what
Mhm.
you're saying, what I hear you saying is like, well, there's no going back to that, but maybe there's something about that world that can we reclaim some of those values? And
Mhm.
maybe one of those things is civility. So I think one of the things you're talking about here is in a sense in which we are moving. Some sociologists call it the difference between a high trust society and a low trust society.
Mhm.
So in a high trust society, you feel comfortable leaving your doors unlocked. In a high trust society, when you're in the grocery store and maybe you bump somebody on accident, in a high trust society, you're more likely to be like, oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. In a low trust society, you're more likely to imply some sort of nefarious reason by
Mhm.
why somebody bumped you in the grocery store walking down the same aisle. So, how do you get back to a high trust society? I personally think there's something to do with a loss of a shared narrative and story. So we've had a fracturing of our identity as a as not whether it's locally at your state or regional level, but nationally as well. And so you have to figure out what would be the thing that would bind us together. That's actually behind the Latin word for religion, which is religio. Religio means that which binds. And so, obviously, I'm interested in religion, so sometimes everything becomes a nail that I use my religion hammer for. But there is a sense in which like we've lost some sort of shared story. And that shared story decreases our trust together because we don't feel like we have the same values. And some of that does increase a sense that we've lost civility. And at the same time, I do think perhaps maybe some of that is over exaggerated by the amount of time we spend online or connected to cable news.
Mhm.
Okay, I have like two things to kind of comment on this. In the civility article, Ray Dalio mentions that we've kind of abandoned our ability or our desire to compromise, and it's kind of
Mm.
this win at all cost mindset has taken over. And that seems to be, obviously a problem. Um, and then the other comment I have is just that we have this like lack of just general respect for each
Mhm.
other's values. So it's kind of like my values, my way or the highway. It feels like that's kind of the shift that's been happening. How do you kind of asked this too, how do you set like the new code of conduct or a new aspirational like shared story, shared vision for these morals that aren't maybe rooted in religion, but it's something that everybody can get behind and say, okay, this is how we want to operate.
Well, let me add to that. The question, I think, or one big question is, do we have enough people who could recognize, oh, we have an issue here, and I as an individual want to do something to participate differently?
I'll speak to one dimension of that, and that is, I think, what makes this even more difficult before we even get to figuring out the solutions behind what would increase our sense of of a high trust society. What could unite us in some sort of shared story that would still allow for differences, right? I think that's what Clay's talking about. And
Mhm.
where there was, especially with our founders and the framers of the Constitution, there was this sense in which many of them were like devout Christians. Some of them were deists. Some of them believed in something just that you would call natural law. And the idea was generally reasonable people can discern the patterns of nature and reason to kind of land at least in some a semblance of a shared story that would allow you to not feel like you needed to kill your neighbor, right? Like what could bind us together? And I think one problem that we're facing is that the incentive structures in social media and becoming a content creator and the incentive structures in much of cable news is they're all driven by how to capture attention. And we know that the thing that most captures attention is the thing that we could say, and Clay can speak to this more directly than I can, kind of speaks to our lizard brain, right?
Mhm.
It's the fight or flight response, it's the outrage. And when just think about your average Instagram scroll, right? And Instagram has become essentially like, it's TikTok for millennials or younger Gen Xers. What are the things that you're most likely to stop at? Well, it might be humor. There's a dimension to that. There's also a dimension in which like something sparks your curiosity. But so much of our algorithms are prone to hit that thing which instantly catches our flight or fight response.
Mhm.
And so when it's outrage that we're feeding on, and people begin to develop financial incentives to continue to feed outrage, I think just an awareness of the way in which what I often call like attention farming works is a good first step to know as I'm scrolling on something or I have a bunch of podcasters or YouTubers that I begin to notice when I listen to them, I feel more anxious. I feel more angry towards my neighbor. If this is producing these feelings in me, even if there is some sort of educational or entertainment trade-off, I need to really assess whether or not it's in my best interest to potentially keep feeding their best interest, which is my attention. So I think we're going to have to develop practices around our screen usage. One thing I do is just like I do for my teenagers, I set screen limit on my own phone.
Mhm.
So Instagram, when it hits a certain time, I get just like my kids do. That's all your Instagram time for the day or your time on X. And I think I need to do that to safeguard the ways in which I know these things might be shaping my mind and my soul in a particular way that I don't like. So I think that's an important first step.
So, Clay, I think that's
Mhm.
a perfect segue into curiosity and how we can train ourselves to be more curious because,
Mhm.
isn't like the combination, or maybe they're kind of the same thing in a lot of ways, but curiosity and reflection, those two things seem pretty vital, like, and have to be almost intentionally developed in order to have the type of, run through that mental analysis that you are describing, Paul.
Yeah. And directly related to Paul's point, it's actually hard to be curious if
Mhm.
you feel threatened. So,
Yes.
to his observation about fight or flight, one of the things that happens for humans is we have an orientation towards defense. Like we want to protect ourselves to survive, right? And this can be actual physical threats. Like we hear a noise in the woods and we're like, oh, like I better be hyper vigilant and like take a step back. Um, but because, as we talked about before, we're social and symbolic and cultural organisms, we also see threats that are represented through those more symbolic spaces. Um, so you might see um, like if like in the civil rights era, if a black person saw a cross burning in the lawn, um, they would know there's a clear message being sent, and that's a threat. And it
Mhm.
might be just wood on fire, but it's trying to communicate something. And so because we're symbolic organisms, we we see threats in that way. And the reason I bring up that example is because to Paul's point about social media, the media is this is used all the time where you see these headlines like, and you see it on both sides of politics, where you see like in more conservative outlets, you see, oh, look, the Democrats are trying to destroy, trying to
Mm.
bring in an era of communism or destroy, destroy this country. And then on the other side, you see, oh, look, Republicans are white supremacists, or and you see these exaggerations and misrepresentations um, of the other side, or the amplification of some of the like worst elements of the other side, even if those are minority elements.
Hmm.
But that works on us because we see those things even though it just seems like it's like digital text on a screen, we see those as symbolizing a real threat to our lives, to our, if not our physical lives, to our, to our values, to our way of living, the way we want to live. So it's hard, that's just to say like we've got to tone that stuff down
Mm.
to cultivate a climate in which curiosity can thrive. Developmental
Hmm.
psychologists used to study this in what they called attachment style. And what they learned is starting very early in life, toddlers are more likely to explore their environment if they have what's called a secure base, a secure attachment. Historically, this was mom. So they would do these studies and they, take toddlers into these like strange environments where they would have weird things. And they would be in the presence of their mom or not. And it turns out if mom was there and they could kind of look back and see like, oh, mom's, things are okay, things are safe, they'd be more curious. They'd be more willing to experiment. If they put them in a strange place without that secure attachment, they were way more cautious and way more anxious. And so, and that kind of scales up. It turns out, a bunch of attachment research built on that framework to study things like adult romantic relationships. We tend to use our spouses as a source of attachment, and they can embolden us to be, braver and more curious and, more willing to push ourselves. Religion has actually been found to be a powerful attachment source. People have a strong sense of attachment to God, and that increases the kind of explorative mindset that's been studied in attachment literature. So that's a kind of a step one. But then there's actual specific. So if you feel like you can kind of you live in a trust in society, high trust societies allow for more curiosity and exploration because you feel like I don't have to be hyper vigilant about my neighbors or other people trying to threaten me all the time or trying to hurt me in some way. So I don't have to dedicate bandwidth to that, which allows me to do other more interesting things with that energy.
Mm.
Um, then to help cultivate that energy, just as one example, the same technology that we talk about that can be distracting and lead to outrage and all these things can be utilized in healthy ways to energize characteristics we think are positive, like curiosity. So, for instance, I wrote a Substack about some research showing a curiosity-based app that people were using on their phone that gave people this kind of day-to-day reminder and task of like where people would come up with goals that would allow them to become more curious to cultivate their curiosity. And then it was kind of like a daily reminder and a task of, these goals that people set. So somebody might have set a goal like every day on my lunch break, I'm going to listen to a new podcast that teaches me something different. Um, or there were other activities that involved things like just change little things in your life, even if it's something like sleeping on the different side of the bed or trying a
Mm.
different restaurant. And the reason those sorts of little activities work is it turns out that personality is more flexible than we have historically thought. We all know people are different, have, different personalities. Some people are extroverted, some are introverted, some people are really curious and interested in lots of things, and some people not so much. And some of that is heritable. But what we've learned, starting really with studying like couples, is that over time, married couples' personalities tend to become closer together. Right? So if you've been in a long marriage, you can probably recognize this that you do more things like your spouse than you would have done maybe a decade or 20 years ago. Part of that is helps reveal how you can cultivate curiosity, which is this is because you're around your spouse all the time and they do because they have this characteristic. Maybe your spouse is more extroverted than you. you're by default having to do a bunch of things that you wouldn't do on your own normally. And by doing those behaviors, you've become a little bit more extroverted. Your spouse likes to go out and do more things. And so you're going out and doing more things. And so what that provided the groundwork for understanding is that maybe personality isn't just this total top-down thing that dictates our lives and I'm just extroverted or I'm not. But maybe it's it's the like accumulation of little behaviors. And if you focus on changing those little behaviors, those day-to-day behaviors, you can start to change that personality a little bit. It doesn't mean you're an extreme introvert's going to become the most extroverted person in the world, but you can move things a little bit. And we do this in lots of ways because we need to in our lives. Like maybe you have the type of job that requires you to give public presentations and you don't like it, but you're like, this is part of my job. And so you become a little bit more like that. But we can do that in other areas of our lives too, where we'll perhaps feel less compelled to do so simply because we want to. But it takes that kind of day-to-day behavioral change, which can be assisted through technology. That's not the only way to do it. Some people keep journals and every day they write, like I met this person who she said every day she wanted to get out of her house and do something different.
Mhm.
And she was going to just journal about it. And so at the end of the day, she kept herself accountable by saying, what did I do today? That was different than what I did the day before. So it just requires that kind of engagement. And I think that's an example of how we could perhaps start to think about cell phones and not like good or bad, but as how we use them. And we
Mhm.
can use these devices in healthier ways to not push us apart from each other in our
Mhm.
society, but help us have what a great device for learning something about people all over that are far away from you that you might never meet in real life. I mean, all of us wouldn't know each other if it wasn't.
Totally,
We
exactly.
don't live in the same states. We've met thanks to digital technology. And so I think if we think about those things and work on those sorts of activities, we can cultivate the kind of traits that you're talking about, like curiosity.
So we talk about that a lot about how the smartphones, like, yeah, a lot, can go wrong, but if they're harnessed intentionally, a lot could go right. Um,
Hmm.
when I read your article on curiosity, something that I kind of it just kind of popped in my brain was that concept that our personalities are driven by the patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that become automatic over time. I think that's how you put it.
Hmm.
And it almost scared me because I think that right now we're using our phones, a lot of us, and I'm definitely guilty and I'm working on it. Our default is the social media.
Mhm.
And if our thoughts and feelings and behaviors are driving our personalities, and our thoughts and feelings and behaviors are being driven by social media, you know, I guess it's no wonder we're kind of in the
Mhm.
situation that we're in where we're having to
Hmm.
really take this, really deep look at all of this and figuring out how to be intentional with it in a way that's still, fun and entertaining because at the end of the day, I think it's still okay to have fun and be
Right.
entertained.
Right.
But in a way that's like maybe like for good and like that helps you reach your goals and that improves your life. And then improves society at the same time would be, better.
Well, so, I think we've talked about this with you, Clay, like many times in terms of trying to reach a segment of the population that hasn't necessarily reached this point of curiosity.
Hmm.
And, I think that if statistics tell us one thing, but when you go out into the world and let's just say like airports maybe are a great example, I can really like chart the vibe of airports, let's say, over the past several years. And what I see is a decline just in people are struggling. They are at the end of their ropes,
Hmm.
and it's just a very different energy. And that group of people, like those people, in my opinion, could really benefit from this little bit of like a spark of curiosity or reflection to contemplate these questions. But also, I think that when your life is centered around survival and
Mhm.
surviving is getting harder and harder to do. Like that's what reality is telling us. Um, how do we reach those people? And I think that's really where entertainment comes in. So I'd love to hear y'all's take on that. What are the opportunities present?
So I guess that gets us into the storytelling, the
Exactly.
Superman,
Yeah.
and yeah.
Mhm. Well, that makes me think of even the previous question that you asked. I think is something I'd like to make a more direct connection to because I think we've been talking and reflecting on you're naming something that feels like a problem. And so we want to see a new solution. So we're trying to imagine the pathways there. We've been identifying some obstacles, right? And you've just named another one, the obstacle of what we could call the way in which our social media consumption, the algorithms are shaping our souls in a way that we just don't like. But to talk about a solution, I think moves us beyond. Certainly, we could say, well, I want to remove this obstacle. And I might do something like put a screen time limit on my phone. But I think what's really required, and just to give both of you kudos in the last few weeks in which I've become more acquainted with the work you're doing, is I think it's not just the removal of obstacles. It's going to take people banded together to create new pathways, to create new networks, to create new institutions, right? This can't just be a one person. You're not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to buck up against the entire system as a lone individual. It's going to take people united with shared values, at least some shared overlapping story, and starting to build new things. And I think one of the historical examples that comes to mind when we were talking here was I think back to you can go all the way back to you can all go all the way back to like the 6th century BC. When the Babylonians invaded Israel and they sacked the city of Jerusalem and they took all of the Hebrew people off into captivity. So now they're in a foreign culture with very different values. And there's this interesting excerpt that's recorded in the book of Jeremiah where the prophet Jeremiah gives the people some interesting instructions because they're like, what do we do here? Do we rebel? Do we tear down the system, right? Should we have a violent revolution? All of that stuff. And there's an interesting insight that I think is applicable to our present moment too. He tells them, build gardens in Babylon, uh, raise healthy children, um, build something different. And you know what he says? He says, seek the welfare of the city, for in their welfare will be your welfare. And so I think of that oftentimes as this, yeah, we feel this juxtaposition. We might call that vibe that you're feeling, in the airport. We could call that vibe like Babylon, right? It's this sense in which, man, I feel like we're being assimilated into something I don't like. It's not leading to life. What can I do? Build gardens right where you're at, metaphorically, and literally,
Yeah.
maybe literally plant a garden in your backyard, but metaphorically too. Build works of beauty and art and culture that tell a better story. They tell a different story. And I think what will happen is it might not blow up to the same level, like from a numeric and statistic that, you might not ever with this podcast. I know this isn't your pursuit to become like top of the charts. It might be practically difficult for a really wholesome conversation like this to instantly spike to getting you, 100 million YouTube subscribers and things like that. But I think if we're so locked in on those like statistical metrics, and we go, well, maybe we should tweak what we're doing to meet that market. No, no, no. That's how you get assimilated, right? So instead, I think one really important thing for your listeners and just to affirm what both of you are doing is just to say, we're going to have to build something different, something that would be an alternative for people that they will bottom out on that stuff. They will hit a breaking point in which they go, I can't do this anymore. Like, I don't like the way I feel. And then they see the alternative or they hear the alternative in a conversation like the ones both of you are hosting. They go, I just like the way that feels better. I'm going to give more of my attention to that. And so we need people to work together collaboratively to build alternative frameworks, institutions, whether it's in our education system, whether it's in social media, and whether also, as you're mentioning, like to tell better stories that fill our big screens and our small screens that we're consuming that might be shaping us in a better direction.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Clay, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with all those points. I mean, it's one of the things I should have said in the last question too, which I think is relevant here, is one of our goals at Archbridge is to highlight and showcase where there is a lot of agreement and a lot of positive trends, because we're used to seeing negative trends. Like I remember last year I saw a report from a major organization. I'm not going to pick on them, but it was like a worker, like American workers, and it was like Americans are stressed at, their jobs, and we've heard the story. Most Americans, are exhausted at their jobs. So I went and looked at the report, and I was like, oh, they buried the more important finding, which was the vast majority of Americans said they're happy at work. So they're happy with their
Hmm.
jobs. So
Right.
then what they did is, then they asked a bunch of questions about like stress and things like that, and you get high reports of stress too. But there was a complete story, which was Americans are simultaneously stressed about many things, but grateful for many things. And so oftentimes we don't tell that complete story. And so I think to Paul's point about building something new, one of the things we're trying to do at Archbridge is find we're not trying to like deny problems or act like these issues don't exist, but we're trying to find areas in which maybe we could have a little bit more gratitude and a little bit more celebration. So,
Mhm.
for instance, we do an annual survey on the American dream, and you see all these news headlines that the American dream is supposedly dead
Mhm.
or no longer exists. But the vast majority of Americans say they believe in the American dream, and they say that they have achieved it or are on their way to achieving it. But what's interesting is then if you ask them how achievable is the American dream to other people, they become more pessimistic. So we have this interesting challenge, and we've seen this in our research on hope as well, where people are hopeful for their own future, they're hopeful for their family, but you ask them about the country, they're more pessimistic. And so, because of the way we're consuming these stories that Paul's talking about, we look at the world and we see darkness. But in our own lives, we can see evidence that, oh, we have people that care about us. Yeah, we have problems, but we have things that are important and rewarding experiences. So it's easier for us to push back against those negative stories in our own lives because we can bring to bear our own experiences. But when we look at the world, we don't have other people's experiences. And so we have this interesting challenge. And so that's where I think, to Paul's point, we need to build institutions, we need to build organizations, media content, stories that help people better see the positive and the rest of the country and the rest of society, and not just in their own lives. And I think I think people are hungry for that. Paul and I have talked about this a lot. This is, some of his great insights is that on this, or like, it seems like people are getting kind of tired of the negativity,
Mhm.
of the pessimism, of the cynicism. They are looking for something else. I remain pretty bullish on humans. I think we have challenges that come in, and we're in this technological age right now where we have these new technologies and we're not really sure what to do with. But we're smart, we're resilient, and we typically kind of figure things out. And so, my assumption is that we'll get a handle on this, and we'll figure out a healthier way to manage and to relate to this technology. But Paul's absolutely right. Like we need these stories to connect us and inspire us.
Well, and I'm excited to hear that you guys are optimistic like that. And I do think because of technology, it could change overnight. It
Mhm.
could really, the culture could shift pretty quickly, if the right thing kind of ignites, if the right thing really just resonates with everybody, if
And that
everybody,
that is the
that's.
unique opportunity that
Hmm.
maybe hasn't been present, at least in the history we're aware of yet. And maybe part two of this conversation, we could get into aliens. You're bullish on humans. but what else is out
Yeah,
there?
I love how we said we could 20 minutes.
Oh, this is classic.
Sorry.
Yes.
We
No,
can
we're
only
going to wrap this up now. Thank you guys so much. What a really fun, insightful conversation. And I feel like we could probably, I could at least listen to y'all for several more hours. So hopefully this isn't our last time to chat or collaborate.